The Strait of Hormuz closed on a Tuesday, not metaphorically, not as a diplomatic warning or a sanctions threat or a strongly worded resolution from Geneva. Physically closed. Naval mines laid in shipping lanes that moved 20% of the world's oil. Drone strikes on tankers trying to run the gauntlet anyway. By the time the US-Israel-Iran conflict crossed into its third week in late February 2026, the math was simple and catastrophic. 17 million barrels per day gone. That number doesn't mean much until you sit with it. Every hospital generator in Europe, every container ship running Asian electronics to American ports, every fuel pump on every highway in every country that still had one. All of it downstream from a 21-mile bottleneck that Iran had just turned into a kill zone. And while the rest of the Gulf states watched their tankers idle in a war zone with nowhere to go, Saudi Arabia reached for something they'd built 45 years ago and hoped they'd never need: a back door. It's called the East-West Pipeline, Petroline, and most people have never heard of it, which is exactly how contingency plans are supposed to work until the moment they aren't contingencies anymore. The origin story matters. 1981. The Iran-Iraq tanker war. Saudi planners watched Iranian and Iraqi forces trade strikes on Gulf shipping and ran the numbers on what happened to the kingdom if the strait closed. The answer came back the same every time: economic collapse. Total, fast, irreversible. So they built a way out. Not a diplomatic way out, not a sanctions exemption or a back-channel negotiation. Steel and concrete and engineering buried beneath the Arabian desert. Twin pipelines, 48 and 56 inches in diameter, stretching 1,200 kilometers from the oil fields of the eastern province across the Adana Desert, through the Hijaz Mountains, and out to the Red Sea coast. They built it once, hoped the math never came due, and went back to pumping oil through Hormuz like everyone else. March 2026 called in the debt. Here's what moving crude oil across a desert actually means. It doesn't flow, not on its own. Crude is thick, heavy, resistant. It doesn't want to move, and it especially doesn't want to move uphill through mountain ranges in 50-degree heat across terrain that shifts under the pipe every time the sand decides to. So Aramco built 11 pumping stations along the route. Not facilities, fortresses, industrial turbines maintaining constant pressure across extreme elevation changes, pushing millions of barrels through steel that expands and contracts with the temperature swings between a Saudi midnight and a Saudi noon. Engineers monitoring thermal stress around the clock because a fractured weld at Station 4 doesn't mean a delay, it means the back door closes and there is no third option. For decades, this system ran at partial capacity, a backup, a quiet hum in the background of the global energy system that nobody needed to think about. Then Aramco CEO Amin Nasser gave the order: full capacity. Every station, maximum pressure around the clock. 7 million barrels per day. The absolute mechanical limit of the system. A volume so large it could fill over 4,000 Olympic swimming pools every single day, moving through pipes buried under desert that the rest of the world forgot existed. This wasn't maintenance mode anymore. This was a full-scale industrial mobilization happening in silence while the Persian Gulf burned on satellite feeds. The oil arrives at Yanbu, or it used to arrive at Yanbu. In February 2026, Yanbu was a mid-sized port city on the Red Sea coast, loading around 1.4 million barrels per day onto tankers headed north. Unremarkable. Functional. The kind of city that appears in energy industry reports and nowhere else. By mid-March, it was something else entirely. Export volumes passed 2.5 million barrels per day and climbing toward 3.8. Satellite imagery showing more than 27 very large crude carriers anchored offshore. Ships 330 meters long carrying 2 million barrels each, queued up in holding patterns like wide-body jets stacked over a fogged-in airport. Logistics coordinators running cargo sequencing for a port that had tripled its throughput in 6 weeks. The fastest transformation of a civilian energy hub in the history of the industry, happening under operational pressure that left no margin for the kind of mistakes that civilian operations absorb without noticing. But there's a gap, and the gap matters. The pipeline can push 7 million barrels across the desert. Yanbu cannot export all of it. Factor in the Yasref refinery running domestic processing. Factor in Saudi internal energy demand. Factor in physical berth limitations at a port that was never designed for this volume. The actual export ceiling lands around 4.5 million barrels per day. That's not a rounding error. That's 2.5 million barrels per day sitting in a pipe with nowhere to go, building pressure against a bottleneck on the Red Sea coast, while the world's oil markets watch the clock. The logistics teams working the Yanbu terminal right now are managing one of the most complex real-time resource allocation problems on Earth. Every hour, every day, in a high-stakes environment that punishes the second mistake the same way it punishes the first. Now comes the part the pipeline can't solve. The oil loads onto the VLCCs. The tankers depart Yanbu heading south, and immediately they run into the same logic that created the crisis in the first place. Because geography doesn't care about engineering solutions. Geography just sits there, patient and indifferent, waiting for you to realize you haven't solved the problem. You've relocated it. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, 20 miles wide at its narrowest point, connecting the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. Known in Arabic as the Gate of Tears, which is the kind of name a body of water earns over centuries of ships that didn't make it through. Under normal conditions, it carries 8 to 12% of global seaborne oil trade. Under current conditions, it sits directly inside the operational range of Houthi forces in Yemen, Iranian-aligned, missile-equipped, and running drone and naval attack campaigns against Red Sea shipping since 2023. The VLCCs loaded at Yanbu are too large to transit the Suez Canal at full load. They cannot go north, which means 70 to 75% of the oil diverted through the Yanbu passage has exactly one route to market: south, through Bab el-Mandeb, through the Gate of Tears, through a corridor where major shipping companies have already begun rerouting vessels around the continent of Africa rather than risk the transit. Add 6,000 miles, add 2 weeks, add fuel costs and insurance premiums that don't disappear when the tanker docks. They embed themselves in the price of every downstream product those barrels eventually become. The risk didn't leave the map when Hormuz closed. It followed the oil south and set up at the next choke point like it had always been there, because it had. Zoom out further and the picture gets worse. The stability of the Yanbu passage now depends on the political stability of the Horn of Africa. Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, countries that don't appear in most conversations about global energy security because they weren't relevant to global energy security until 6 weeks ago. Now they sit along the most critical active energy corridor on Earth. If the regional instability that's been simmering across the Horn accelerates, and it has reasons to accelerate, the Yanbu strategy doesn't bend, it breaks. The fallback from the fallback is the Cape of Good Hope, around the southern tip of Africa. Nearly 6,000 additional miles per voyage, weeks of delay per shipment, costs that scale with every tanker that makes the reroute until the arithmetic of global oil delivery looks nothing like it did in January. Here's what Saudi Arabia understands that the market is still pricing in. This is not a temporary fix. The Yanbu passage was activated as a crisis response, but it's being built out as a permanent reorientation. Under Vision 2030, the entire Red Sea corridor is being reimagined. Power infrastructure, desalination systems, security architecture layered over the pipeline route. Long-range plans to eventually move hydrogen through the same system when the oil era ends on its own timeline. The kingdom is not treating this as an emergency workaround. It is treating it as the new geography of Saudi economic power, a shift from Gulf-dependent exporter to Red Sea power. From one ocean facing east toward Asia to another ocean facing west toward Europe and south toward Africa.